Good evening, guys. I hope you all had a nice weekend, and thanks for taking the time out to join us on this Monday evening. And I'm really looking forward to tonight's call. As we all know, it's with our friend and amazing person, actually, Dr. Colin Robertson. And this evening, he's going to be going through how to understand the blood test. Obviously, Zinzino is the world leading Trondheim blood testing company and has done 630,000 tests on healthy people. So Colin this evening is going to go through the fine detail and give us the importance of everything that the blood test reveals. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my good friend, Dr. Colin Robertson.
Good evening, folks. It's Monday night, isn't it? I kind of lose track of days, really, even though the world's kind of trying to go back to normal today, I guess, a little bit. I'm going to go through, for those who don't know, if you've shown up not really sure what it is we're going to talk about, it's kind of in a bit of a comfort zone for me because it's a bit more like a traditional scientific lecture, this. But I'm very mindful of the fact that whereas typically I'll do this to a group of MSc students or PhD students, so I kind of know the background and level of each individual. Tonight, it could be speaking to somebody who's got a DSc, PhD, could be a medical doctor, all the way through to someone who's listening about these kind of things for the very first time. So I'm going to try and keep it really close to the middle track and explain things as simply as I possibly can, which is the best way to discuss science anyway, in my opinion. I was going to get a code and go through the test website and show you as you would see it if you'd done a balance test with Zinzino, and you'd see the feedback that you've got. However, there's all kinds of GDPR issues with doing that, and it wouldn't be appropriate to do that way. So I've put together a slide deck, and I can see everybody cheering now because they're going to get PowerPoint for the next 51 minutes. But I'm going to try and, not bore any of us to tears. Believe me, as someone who's been lecturing now for nearly 20 years of their life, PowerPoint bores me to death. I hate delivering with PowerPoint slides. I hate looking at PowerPoint slides. But we're going to go through it together because I recognize some faces on here, but I'm sure the rest of you, we form a quick alliance. And we're going to go through what the balance test tells people because it's the number one. It's the number one question that we get. Anybody working in the scientific team at Zinzino, the number one question that we get is, right, I got my code, looked at my balance test results. What does it mean? There's a ton of information on there. What's it all about? So that's what I'm going to take you through. So I would wholeheartedly recommend that you grab one of these and a bit of paper to make a couple of notes as we go through. And bear in mind that this is science. It's not mathematics. So right and wrong answers don't exist here. It's all about investigation, interpretation, analysis. And that's what science does. And there's always reasons why you make choices over the certain things that you do. And Zinzino itself embraces what's known as the Kaizen mindset, which is to ever evolve, to keep trying to improve and do things better. So what we're going to discuss now, I'll let you into a little secret already, is we're already discussing how can we make that better? How can we make the balance test feedback better, more specific, easier to understand, and easier to apply? So everything we're going to do today covers what the balance test tells you today. And I would imagine by the end of this year, I'll be doing presentations to people to say, right, we've updated the balance test website. This is what it tells you now, and this is why it tells you this, okay? So on that note, without further ado, mindful of the fact that it is a Monday evening, I will bring up the slide deck and we will get stuck in, okay? So we're literally going to go through understanding that, but right from the start of taking your bloods all the way through to how long you have to wait and what it's all about. That's what we're going to go through. It's a lot of information, and I could easily get distracted and go off on a tangent and start to discuss all manner of different things. And I'm now putting my watch on the side here so I can keep a track of time as I go through this so I don't get too lost. If Jay, Vibeke, Kate, if you think I'm gone right off on one and there's no chance I can steer this back towards the conclusion in time, just give me a shout, okay? And I'll wade back towards the main theme. If anyone's got any questions that they want to ask, either make a note of them yourself and hang on till the end. I'll leave a few minutes to answer any questions that you might have. And other than that, let's get stuck in. So why would you want to listen to me? Well, I joined Enzino back in December last year, and I'm a scientific researcher. That's what I am, morning, noon, and night. I'm really only interested in what we can measure and what we can provide like substantial evidence for. I'm not a big fan of testimony, of anecdotes, of sharing wonderful stories. I think they're great, and it never ceases to amaze me what people, experience. But to me, I'm right down bottom line. What's the measurable difference? What happens systemically? What happens pathologically, physiologically? Can we measure it? Can we repeat it? How accurate is that? Great. That's what we'll work off. That's what we'll work off, and they're the changes we'll bring. And everything that has gone into the balance test and the decisions that were made over what data to give back was informed by an outstanding group of researchers and scientists, so that it does best represent what is drawn upon across the widest research evidence that's out there, whether that's in health, sports performance, specific disease conditions. So that was what informed the decisions that were made. Okay, so these are not arbitrary, but what I'm going to do is just talk about what is actually available to you on the website. So it's an analysis. This is the first big question that we get asked. Here's what it is. It is an analysis of 11 fatty acids. Just this morning, somebody sent me an email from part of the world that said, part of the problem we have, Col, is that someone will go to their GP, get their bloods done, and their doctor will say everything's fine. And then we've got this blood analysis that says that, this ratio is not right, and that your omega-6 to 3 ratio isn't great. So the GP is telling them their bloods are fine, and we're telling them their bloods aren't. GPs don't, as standard practice, measure this. That's why. It's a different type of blood analysis. You can request it. They are not obliged to give it to you. Some GP surgeries are better than others, but this is a specific assessment of those 11 fatty acids, that blood lipid profile, which GPs don't do when they look at your GP count. What they're looking at typically are your blood sugar levels, or they might be looking for other specific factors, markers within your blood based on whatever it is they're investigating. More often than not, though, it's a blood sugar profile, not a fatty acid profile, not a blood lipid profile. So they don't look at this. Okay, so, and more often than not, where they're interested in this, it's upon specialist request, and funnily enough, they get their data and their testing goes off to all the same labs that most anybody else uses. So this is 11 fatty acids, and here's what they are. These are the ones that are measured. So you've got your saturated fats, you've got your palmitic acid, and you've got your stearic acid. We've got omega-9, the oleic acid. Then we've got our omega-6, and we've got our omega-3s. We've got those two big categories there. And anybody who knows anything about balance oil, who knows anything about the balance test, a big part of what we're interested in is that ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, because it's well established physiologically, pathophysiologically, what that means at a cellular level. Okay, that's the difference between exogenous, the food we eat, and endogenous, what happens within the body and within the cell. Comes down to the ratios of this omega-6 and omega-3. So that's everything that's measured. They're the 11 fatty acids that are assessed. When it comes to saturated fats, and most people know that saturated fats get a pretty bad rap when it comes to the foods that we eat. And like always, it's not always as black and white as that. But on the whole, we do aim to keep our saturated fats low. However, again, back to that difference within the blood versus what we eat, when saturated fats are higher, well, then we know that this is common within certain kinds of conditions that are unfavorable. For instance, there's a project I'm working on at the moment for Zinzino with regards to type 2 diabetes. And one of our key markers within this is increased levels of saturated fat within the blood. So we're looking at that within a very specific context with a research project that I'm heading up. So it's important to us overall when we start to get an analysis of what's happening with your blood lipid profile. Okay, so this is really important, okay, because a lot of issues that people encounter start here, the dry blood spot test. So you're going to do a balance test, you get your kit, and you have this little trigger, you prick your finger, and you get a few drops of blood on the Whatman filter paper. Now, I can't emphasize this enough, okay? In my previous life, 5-6 months ago, I was head of a big laboratories in Greater Manchester. And if you came into our laboratories to get any kind of testing done, we would manage that, okay? You wouldn't be left to make any decision. We would prepare you, prepare the area. If we were taking bloods, if we were doing a DBS, a dry blood spot test, if we were doing, venous, we would take care of everything. But because you're doing this at home, it's really important that you follow the guidelines. And this is the key one. You've got to make sure your hands are clean and dry, and that there's no chance that there's any fat on the skin. Okay, so hand cream can impact on it. A classic one that I'm convinced happens more often than not, because you can kind of see some of the adverse effects in the data we see, is somebody just had a sandwich or made themselves a bit of toast, and then they go, right then, I'm going to do that test. This blood test is measuring fats. So if there's anything in that hand cream, if you've just ate that nice big piece of toast, you've had your sandwich, whatever it is, that will interfere with the reading. Okay, so it has to be that you got a nice little standardized protocol, nice, clean, dry hands, that little pinprick, get the blood spots on the Whatman filter paper, that's it, done. Send that off to the laboratory by post. Typically turnaround the moment now is less than 2 weeks. You register your test by entering your test ID and filling out the form, okay? All the data is anonymous. Now, this is really interesting and important for you to know. Only you know your test ID, and anyone you tell that to, which is entirely up to you, but only you know. Vitas Labs don't know who you are, and they're the independent labs that do all the analysis. Zinzino don't know who you are. Vitas can't tell Zinzino, Zinzino can't tell Vitas, nobody knows. It's a 3-part anonymous process, okay? So only you know, only you with that code has access to your data. So let's get into the heart of it. Where do we start from? So you've waited a couple of weeks and your data has been analyzed, and there's some findings for you to understand about yourself, okay? The first thing, which is the big thing that everybody wants to know because it's been talked about a lot, is their omega-6/3 balance, okay? So this is the first thing that's going to be delved into, and this is literally your level of balance is defined as a ratio. Simply put, how much of one thing there is to another. And in this instance, it's how much omega-6, the AA, there is to the omega-3, the EPA. And the EPA is really important, largely because of it's the one most connected with those kind of anti-inflammatory properties, okay? EPA and DHA, the fundamental marine omega-3s, play similar roles in some parts, but we know that the EPA is the one that has a greater propensity towards that anti-inflammatory status within the cell, and the DHA has far more impact and connotations with things related to the brain. Okay, so in this instance, when we're looking at that 6:3 ratio, what we want to know is how much of the AA there is compared to the EPA, and that's what your balance is. Balance within that cell. And this gives us a direct indication, therefore, to the levels of cellular inflammation. And that's why it's important. Without delving too much at this stage into inflammation and what all that's about, anybody who's anyone knows that that needs to be kept in check. Being in an inflamed state is not a good thing to do. It's essential in the first instance. I'll come back to that in a minute. but over a longer period of time, it's negative, has huge negative connotations. So we want to make sure that at a cellular level, things are nicely balanced and contained. So that's the first thing that you get told about when you get your test. So this ratio approximates the distribution between the vegetable fatty acids and fish fatty acids in your diet. Okay, and we can see this nice little graphic there on the right. A surplus of vegetable omega-6 fatty acids will make a diet unbalanced and potentially pro-inflammatory. Now, omega-6 and the acute inflammatory response is a vital part of how your body protects itself. So when you get a cut on the finger, if you trip over a curb, if you get a cough or a cold, that acute inflammatory response is a part of your survival mechanism. It sends the signal for your body to respond and kick in those immune responses that are going to heal the situation. We don't want to lose that. However, when we are overwhelmed with omega-6 and there are insufficient amounts of omega-3, well, we get that acute part, but what we don't get then is the counterbalance of bringing everything back down to that normalized state. And over time, that has very negative consequences. And we're trying to avoid that. We're trying to be proactive and preventative in our health steps. So what we want to do is optimize the cellular status. Because I say this on every single talk that I give, and I'm going to say it again now. Myself, all of you on this call this evening, you are a collection of billions of cells that are constantly working over, regenerating. That's how we live. These build up and build up till we reach full maturation around about age 21. From that point, we're in the aging cycle, and little by little, tiny amounts, that cellular turnover slows down, changes happen to our cellular status, and we are the outcome of the condition of those cells, because that's what we're made out of. So more and more of the research around certain kind of health factors has delved into this, because it's literally the building blocks of life. And what we know is that when there's a better ratio, there are better health outcomes. So a surplus of those vegetable omega-6 acids make a diet unbalanced, potentially pro-inflammatory. And the optimal ratio of omega-6, that AA versus the omega-3 EPA, is less than 3:1. And we know through the test data, and I think as of today, currently on file, because Zinzino has the largest database on this in the world, bar none. There is approaching 630,000 tests in that database now. And what we see is that particularly across the UK, Europe, United States, we see people up on average around about 14, 15:1. So way outside of what we would call a omega balanced state within the cell. And we know that from that, not only is there a greater risk, but there's a greater reality of that sustained inflamed status within the cell. So the first thing you get told is where you are at on that. What is your score? And for some people, that's all they want to know. They just want to know, what's my ratio? But because we have access to, we have the opportunity to tell you more than that. So why use the AA and the EPA? So the arachidonic acid, the AA, is essential when it comes to that acute inflammatory response. But when levels are too high, it has negative implications, okay? Promoting a prevailing inflamed state. Your body uses the EPA to produce signaling molecules called eicosanoids. These play numerous physiological roles in reducing inflammation. So these guys are going around and they're signaling with regards to reducing pro-inflammatory markers and helping to maintain a normative environmental state. Normalized doesn't get used enough in health terms anymore. Everybody wants to talk about optimal and enhanced and improved, and that's all nonsense. Normal is perfect. Normal is the outcome of 6.5 million years of evolution that we've got in the way of how we've conducted our dietary behavior and our physical activity and exercise behavior over the past 70, 80, 90 years. A normally functioning immune system is a wonder to behold. Normalized cellular ratios is a wonder of nature. That's where we need to be, at those normal levels. Right then, so we're going to leap directly from now. We've got an understanding of what we've looked at and why. We're looking at the difference between those types of omegas, what that means in the context of inflammation. And now we're going into this next phase of feedback that you will receive. You've been told what your 6:3 ratio is. Now we want to look at your protection value. And again, sometimes people will see this data and they'll say, what does that mean? What's really implied by protection? What do you mean by that? So the composition of the cell membrane determines how well you can remember, think, and learn, and how resistant you are to stress, injury, and disease. So that's literally what's being discussed here, is how well protected are you at a cellular level with regards to what these factors add up to. Both layers of the cell are made of fatty acids, and the fatty acids in your diet directly determine the types of fatty acids that end up in your cell membranes. Now then, he says, dramatically pausing for a drink of water. There's an old saying, which I've said countless times, which is you are what you eat. And it's true. Some old sayings stick around because they're accurate and they sum something up perfectly. You are what you eat. And that's not just, I think a lot of people associate that with the notion of what weight they are, what size jeans they get to put on. I think that's the gross terms that people start to consider it on. But it's far more important than that. You are what you eat at a cellular, physiological level. Okay, so what you consume is processed and it reaches every single cell of your body and starts to make a change and a contribution, either negatively or positively, to that status. Okay. A poor diet and stress increases the cell's cholesterol while decreasing its fatty acid content. This reduces cell membrane fluidity and is associated with numerous negative outcomes: depression, memory loss, poor eyesight, low pain threshold, disease. And just to let you in on something, really, in recent terms, certainly over the past 6 to 7 years, I have been asked more and more to comment on factors that relate to psychology and psychophysiology. And I'm a physiologist. I'm not a psychologist. I've worked with athletes. I've worked with military groups and individuals who are taking on, tough tasks. And as a part of that, you work on resilience and mental strength factors. But typically, from my background, that's been through how we manage and put certain kinds of physical and cognitive tasks in someone's way. But because there's been this ever-growing issue with regards to mental health, more and more people not only prepared to say that they're dealing with mental health issues, but literally dealing with it, and how this neatly and directly correlates to these changes that we've seen in our dietary behavior over time. It's another part of what I believe is this global pandemic that existed long before the COVID-19 pandemic, of these chronic conditions that just build up over time. And the common denominator in them all is quality of diet. And it's interesting because correlation isn't always cause and effect, but we are talking about N population size of millions, tens of hundreds of millions, when we look at these shifts in dietary behavior. And there are even better insights. So when we look at the westernization of the Japanese diet, Japan's health statistics looked nothing like Western health statistics until their food became westernized, and they caught up in less than 10 years. We're seeing this in China now. If you want to go online and have a look, there's a big research area called the China Project. And what we're seeing in China is, in big city areas, we're seeing the westernization of dietary behaviors, and we're seeing those kind of health outcomes that match what we see across Western Europe, UK, USA, Australia. And then more recently, we're seeing this across India as the diet becomes westernized. So this correlation isn't always cause and effect, but there's such an overwhelming amount of evidence in the context of this that you can't ignore it either. And also, we see the reverse of this. So where we see people in good cellular status, who don't have an over-reliance on ultra-processed foods, who move more frequently. We see less and less and less of these issues, almost to non-existent. So this has real importance to us. This isn't just science for the sake of science. This isn't just looking at things at a cellular level so we can invent a problem. This is about dealing with the reality of things and getting to the heart of the matter and recognizing that if we don't change things on a cellular level, we can't expect the entire structure to be right if what it's made of isn't right. So this is quite long-winded, but I'm just going to whistle through it for those of you who might be interested and have a background in maths. How we look at your protection value calculation, it's quite involved, to be honest with you. Firstly, 3 recognized health indicators, okay? So the value for an omega-6 percentage is calculated like this, which is the DGLA plus the AA times by 100 divided by the DGLA plus AA, EPA, DPA, DHA. That gives us our first figure. Then we look at the value for the omega-3 level as the sum of the EPA and the DHA. And then thirdly, the balance value is calculated as omega-6 AA versus the omega-3 EPA. Next, each indicator value is given the same weight. So these are weighted averages. Everyone's done that at some point back in school. It's quite straightforward. The second calculation assigned a value between 0 and 100. This is then divided by 3 because we have 3 primary factors to get the protection value, which ideally should be above 90. So that's the maths that sits behind that part of the equation. So we've got an understanding of our ratio now. We've got an understanding of what goes on behind that protection value. And now we're going to go to the index. Now, if I had been working for Zinzino, 10 years ago, rather than just 5 or 6 months ago, I would have started here. And this might be a change that we make to the website as we move forward. I would have started here. The first thing I would have told somebody was their omega-3 index, because this will then empower you to go online, go on Google Scholar or PubMed, somewhere where there's peer-reviewed research, and go omega-3 index and type in your value. And then go and have a look at all the research that comes out with regards to omega-3 index. There's probably more research around the index than there is around the ratio. I mean, there's a stack of work around the ratio, tens of hundreds of thousands of publications. But when it comes to the index, there's even more, okay? Because this is a long-standing risk factor assessment for disease used across multiple disease pathologies. Okay, so I would actually start here. This would be the first thing I would show you, and we may well change the website to reflect that, not just because I say so, but because the Scientific Advisory Board, these are the kind of conversations we're having, and there's a general agreement on that. Again, Kaizen, always looking to make improvements. So risk factors are conditions or habits that make a person more likely to develop a disease. They can also increase the chances that an existing disease will get worse. That is really important, okay? When you work in the space that I work in, and currently I'm a part of the Advanced Clinical Practice Group, working with Health Education England, putting together the curriculum and the outline for what our new advanced practitioners are going to look like in a post-COVID world, dealing with people with multiple comorbidities, cardiovascular disease, metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, COPD, you name it. People often mistakenly think, okay, I've got this and I'm going to take this medication now, and that's going to keep that like that. It's going to suppress the symptoms. I'll feel okay, and that's that. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Remember, a chronic disease, chronic illness, takes time to develop. And the point at which it's diagnosable is the point at which those symptoms are so prolific, are so influential, starting to compromise our quality of life, that we've gone to seek medical support and advice about it. And in some instances, surgery, types of treatment are going to interfere with that, intervene, and hopefully, improve it, bring about positive changes. I'm very reluctant to ever use the word cure. I'm always concerned about the language of curing things. The important thing to note, though, is that very rarely, if ever, do these things not continue to progress at some rate? And that's really important to recognize, because it's not only whether or not we've got it and we go, okay, I've got it, I know what I'm dealing with. We should still be working with our clinical guidance and with our lifestyle management with regards to what we eat and the things that we can do ourselves to improve that situation. Risk factors can be modified to slow or halt the progression of a disease, and sometimes can even reverse them, certainly in the instance of type 2 diabetes. So we have our risk zones, and feel free to go and check these out. There's a ton of interesting work around these. So if you have an index, omega-3 index less than 4, you're high risk. If you're intermediate risk, if you are less than 4 to 8, but you are low risk if your omega-3 index is greater than 8%. So if there is sufficient amount of omega-3 above 8%, then you're very low risk. This is really good. And when we see a good ratio, we typically see a good omega-3 index score as well, typically. Okay, that's what you'll see a line up. So the two kind of go hand in hand a little bit. It's very rare that you would have a good index and a low ratio, and it's very rare that you'd have a good ratio and a low index. But the human body is capable of anything. Believe me, the more you study it, the more you find out. But those typically line up quite neatly. So the natural level of EPA in the blood is 4.1, whilst the natural level of DHA is 4.7, and combined they should be above 8%, preferably around about 10%. The daily requirement of marine omega-3s, EPA and the DHA is dependent on your individual body weight, and hence why if you're using balance oil, it's 0.15 mil per kilogram of your own body weight, so that what you consume is relative to your own body mass. That's really, really important, because obviously different size and weights mean that we have fundamentally different requirements when it comes to the EPA and the DHA. So an adult weighing 80 kilograms will need to consume approximately 3 grams of omega-3, EPA and DHA daily to get their EPA and DHA above that 8%. And remember, it's not a target. Once you hit it, you're there. It's about getting there and staying there. And there's an old saying, which is staying there is much harder than getting there. And the reason being is it comes down to human behavior, because more often than not, we're not very rational. More often than not, there's this kind of target, and then we get there, and then we kind of go, right, well, that's it now. Yeah, feel okay. Didn't take it yesterday. Yeah, didn't take it. I've run out. I'll leave it a week. I'll buy some more at the end of the month. And it really is about maintaining daily amounts, certainly weekly amounts. And the easy way to create weekly amounts is to achieve daily amounts. That's the way to take this forward. I promise you, that's probably the most accurate statement I could make. Right then, so we've done ratio, protection level, index, mental strength. Now, when I first came across this, I had an issue with what this is titled, and I still have an issue with what this is titled, because I know that most people, when they think of mental strength, and I would agree, this is how I would think of mental strength, you're thinking of the capacity that you or someone has to deal with something that's tough times, a difficult situation, a difficult set of circumstances, and the mental strength it takes to persevere and get through. And so mental strength, when it's against this category, you kind of understand why they've said that now, but I still don't think it's the right way to describe it. So this is definitely one of the things we're going to change, is the title of this part. But I'm going to explain what's meant in this instance by mental strength. So how does EPA and DHA strengthen the brain? So EPA and DHA function exclusively via the cell membranes in which they are anchored. That's how they behave. That's how they get to do what it is that they do. DHA is proven to be essential to both pre and postnatal brain development. There are critical periods. One is in utero, so there's one whilst they're in the womb, and then that up to developmental stage age 2. Okay, so these are what we would call critical periods. However, we also know that DHA is vital with regards to brain function, development, and maintenance as we develop beyond that point. So it's not a case of so long as we've had it in that time, we're okay and set for life. That couldn't be further from the truth. They're critical periods when we want to make sure there's enough available. So that relates to the mother's diet and then what the child consumes within those first 2 years. But beyond that, the DHA in the diet that's available to us within the cell is critical with regards to how it preserves and supports cognitive function. So both DHA and EPA generate neuroprotective metabolites, protecting the cells against cell damage, degeneration, and impairment. And these are all phrases and terms that people become far more familiar with in the modern age as we discuss things like dementia, early onset, onset of dementia, and Alzheimer's. Also, something that's of interest of me, because even though I'm no longer primarily based in a big university anymore, I'm still fascinated with how people learn and what learning is, because I've always held true to the philosophy and belief that intelligence is malleable. Anybody can learn. Anybody can become highly intelligent if they're prepared to work at it and do what's required. It's like a muscle. It needs to be flexed and it needs to be nurtured in the same way. But just like a muscle, it requires the right nutrition to grow. And what we've seen, as we've seen these dietary changes over the past 70, 80 years, whilst there's this strong correlation between a downgrade in dietary behavior and an increase in chronic disease and those kind of conditions, we've also seen a decade on decade decrease in the average IQ across the US, UK, Western Europe, pretty much around the world. Again, you are what you eat. And so the DHA and the EPA is so important, particularly the DHA in this context, with regards to our cognitive capacity in order for our brain to function. EPA influences behavior and mood. If you are if there is higher levels of systemic inflammation, we know that has a negative impact on our mood state, more likely to be depressed, have dark, brooding thoughts, become quite introverted, anxious. These kind of things are associated with that. DHA is the main omega-3 fat in your brain and is essential for a fully functioning nervous system. EPA helps to keep the heart and blood vessels healthy and has also been proven to fend off symptoms of depression. Higher intake of omega-3 fats is directly linked to reduced risk of declining mental ability, characteristic of different types of dementia, including Alzheimer's. And both EPA and DHA are recognized for their capacity to fight inflammation within the body. So there's a lot of times when people are reluctant to discuss things on these terms because there is a compulsion to think only of mood state being influenced by emotions, when in fact we know, and it's long standing within the research and the evidence, that emotions can be triggered by the foods that we consume, and we start to get into this negative cycle. Most people who've shown any interest in nutrition will understand the dopamine cycle. So, binge eating or comfort eating. Well, what is comfort eating? Comfort eating is a simple process of you don't feel great, something has upset you, you feel in a low mood, and so you go to a comfort type food. Comfort type foods are typically personified by they either have high sugar, high fat, or high salt. Sugar seems to be the primary go-to one in Western industrialized nations. So someone's feeling a little bit down, depressed, and they go and get the tub of ice cream out the fridge. They go and get the chocolate bar, whatever it is. They consume that food, whack, dopamine is released, okay? So we get the dopamine cycle and we start to get the dopamine flood and we feel better. That's why it's a comfort food. It triggers the dopamine response. So then we've done that, and pretty much as we eat, we get more and more of a flood of our dopamine response. So we're getting the comfort that we seek, and then we put it away. That wears off. We feel dark and depressed and upset again, and we remember what made us feel good, that comfort food, and we go and have more of it. There's a problem with that cycle. Most of those foods lead to excessive calorie consumption. Most of those foods lead to increased inflammation. Most of those foods are typically nutritionally very, very poor, don't actually offer a lot other than the core component, the high sugar, the high salt, the high fat. So our emotions can be driven by the types of food we eat. So we've got to break the cycle. At some point, you have to bring about a change. And that's the hardest part. Believe me, as someone who's been working with humans my entire professional life, the hardest part is breaking those behavioral cycles and bringing something else into play. And this is a powerful way to bring that about. Okay, this is a powerful way to make sure that we have sufficient levels of this, and in itself can interfere and break the dopamine cycle. So the mental strength ratio is the balance between omega-6, the AA, and the omega-3s, both of them now, which is the EPA and the DHA. And this value should be below 1:1, okay? So that we should have an equal, if not negative, ratio on that one, okay? Moving on to cell membrane fluidity. And I'm always careful, and I'm becoming more careful in how I describe this to people, because there's a lot of poor explanations. And I really try in an endeavor to simplify it. I don't want to oversimplify it and then give someone the wrong idea. So bear with me on this one. So the ratio between saturated fatty acids and the omega-3 essential fatty acids, the EPA and the DHA, is indicative of the cell membrane fluidity. Okay, the more saturated fats there are in a membrane, the more rigid the membrane becomes. Now, this is really important because it needs to be fluid. It needs to be malleable so that nutrients can get in and toxins can get out. When the membrane becomes rigid, that fundamental aspect of the membrane gets compromised. And I say this to a lot of people: how good would be the nutrients I could get into you if I put gaffer tape across your mouth? You're going to really struggle to get food in, good nutrients in. Likewise, if we stick a cork up the backside, how are we going to get the toxins out? If you bring about blockage in prevention, then the system doesn't work. It's designed for throughput. So the cell membrane fluidity ratio is the cell membrane composition and structural architecture, which is critical for the health of the cells. Whilst this is nicely fluid and letting those nutrients in and getting those toxins out, and the cell is turning over nicely, doing what it needs to do, functioning the way it should function, and we can extrapolate that out times a billion, the whole body is taking care of itself. One of the phrases I most dislike is a detox. You know, we can chemically detox you. If something goes wrong, we rush you into hospital. The other way that you detox is on a daily basis every time you go to the toilet. The body's great at detoxing. But cellular detoxification is very much a real thing. And that's whereby once those nutrients have gone in and they've been spent, they've served their purpose, in order for the cell to receive new nutrients and in order for the cell to maintain its healthy status, it has to get those toxins out. And that's where real toxic environments start to build up, is when the cell can no longer do that. So on the one hand, the membrane needs to be rigid enough to provide sound structural, architecture, but on the other, it needs to be fluid enough to let nutrients in and waste out. And I always think of this the same way the Japanese designed their skyscrapers now to be able to withstand earthquakes and tremors. So they've got to be rigid, they've got to be able to hold form and do what a building does, but there has to be sufficient built in for its structural flexibility in order for it to be able to move and go with the shocks. And that's probably a good way to think of it. It needs to be formed and architecturally sound, but it needs to be dynamic and fluid enough to let that process happen. And that value needs to be less than 4:1, so that we know our cell membrane is as it should be, allowing things to happen as we need them to happen. This takes us now to the arachidonic acid index. AA is the most important omega-6 fatty acid your body is unable to make. Previously, I've heard people talk about the omega-6s like they're the bad guys. They're not. They're good guys. They help with our acute inflammation. However, they become bad guys if that's all we've got and we don't have a sufficient amount of those omega-3s. That goes all the way back to that index. So 6 is not a baddie. There's too much of it. It is a baddie. And I like to kind of compare that to carbohydrate in the diet. Carbohydrate's really good, but if you've got too much carbohydrate, then it's not so good anymore. It's about having things in the right ratio. AA is the starting point to produce hormones involved in physiological inflammation processes, which are triggered to protect your body from infections or injury. And good average values are in the range of 6.5 to 9.5, optimum 8.3. That's where we want to be. However, due to genetics, some people have a lower or higher than average AA production. If your value is below 5%, you may benefit from adding foods high in AA to your diet, such as chicken, turkey, pork, and farmed salmon. If your value is higher than 10%, you may benefit from reducing those down, bringing those down a little bit and managing that through your dietary choices. So that's all the stuff that you will be told about when you've had your code and when you've had your test data. And all of those areas have a potential to be subject to show a positive or negative change. So why do you have to wait 120 days? So you've done your test, you've either massively changed, overhauled your diet, or you've started to take your balance oil, and you're going to do that now for 120 days so you can measure and see what's happened. Well, the life cycle of red blood cells is approximately 120 plus minus 20 days. So we know that by that time, you should have either a complete new set of blood cells or way above 90%. So we're going to get a much clearer insight to where you're at now compared to where you were back then. So after 120 days, we can measure a whole new collection of cells and determine how much of you has changed at a cellular level and where those ratios, those index, those protection values, where they all stand now in the context of how you've behaved in that intervening time. The test is a double-blind test procedure. VTest is GMP certified, it's independent, well-renowned, to be honest with you. I'd heard of VTest up until April 2020. I'd never heard of Enzino. I heard of VTest 20 years ago. It's a world-renowned laboratory. It's got 25 years of experience providing high-quality chromographic analysis, uses cutting-edge technology. It's double-blind. Neither the lab nor Enzino knows who submitted the test. The balanced test ID means that only you can see your data. And you go to xenotest.com, your results will be displayed when you enter your balanced test ID. Any of the data that we have access to is completely blinded, impartial. We have no idea. With the best will in the world, all we can know are regions. That's as close to being able to locate the test data gets for us. And what I mean by regions is Finland, Norway, France. That's it. That's it. Everything else is just what we see as changing within that blood lipid profile. That's the only things that we can see, which is interesting enough. And believe me, as a researcher, I'd love to know more. I'd love to know the gender and the weight and what the person was eating previously and whether they've made any changes to the diet and what's the physical activity and their exercise life and do they smoke. I'd love to know all these things, but we don't. And it's important that there is a cutoff in the data collection so that it remains a double-blinded, impartial, objective assessment for the individual, so that all they're getting is an insight to their own cellular physiology and their own cellular status. So you've done your test, you have the knowledge, now you have the power to make a change. Knowledge isn't power, applied knowledge is power. The important thing is to do something about it. And in the rare occasions, and it is rare, sadly, that somebody gets a test result that says, yep, your ratio is really good, your index is really high, your cell protection is excellent, mental strength factors are great, good stuff. The important thing is to recognize how that's happened and maintain that best practice. And as we go forward, recognizing the things like age start to work against us, changes in our physical activity levels, quite subtle changes to our dietary behavior. So it's about being mindful. So even a really great test should inform changes we intend to make as we go further down the road. However, for the vast majority who sit way outside that required less than 3-to-1, 4-to-1, above 8% on the index, it means making a change right now. That's the only way you can genuinely be preventative in your health practices. Right. Not bad for timing, that. Not bad for timing. So that was quite a scientific talk through for this evening. Thank you for sticking with me. We have got a few minutes left at the end to address any questions that you might want to chuck in. Rebecca has mentioned in the chat, for anyone who's not seen it, I think they talked of mental well-being. That is one of the ones that's come up, Rebecca. So with regards to that mental strength that I said I don't like the title of, and hopefully you'll understand why I don't like the title of it now. Mental well-being has been one that's come into it. Brain status is another one that's come on. It's hard because when you're talking about things on those terms, it's hard to say something without it sounding like a 1970s Hammer House of Horror film, or you sound like you're writing one of those books that's like a kind of go out and conquer the world book, a self-help book. So we'll find a title that better fits than mental strength. But any questions about anything that we've discussed, about those omegas, about what it's telling you, how sensitive they are to change, what it means, anything you like? Still got a few minutes left. Happy to answer anything. Let's have a look. I saw one come in. When it comes to saturated fat, if you're normal in palmitic acid behind stearic acid, how do you know what food is? Are they in the same foods? That's a really good question. So with regards to your saturates, and in reality, I'm a registered nutritionist. I'm registered with the British Dietetics Association. And the reason I'm saying that is to qualify what I'm about to say, because you could have this whole top line here could be full of registered nutritionists, and we'd all potentially have a slightly different take on what I'm about to say now. My take with regards to those saturates is to think of your overall intake of saturated fats, where they're coming from, what kind of foods they're coming from. For a lot of people, and this happens a lot if they don't specifically eat meats, a lot of those things can be coming through from dairy. A lot of those saturates can be coming through from processed foods that they eat. And do recognize that 54% of the UK diet is made up on average of ultra processed foods. So a lot of these things, they're actually hidden in the processing. And so people will ask a question and they'll say, well, how do we get this down because of that? And so for me, it's all about really taking a whole stock look at your diet. Start to consider how much of it is ultra processed, how much of it is processed, how much of it is dairy based or dairy laced, which is where dairy components are used as excipients in other types of foods to fill them out and give them a kind of stable base. And really start to spend, if you're really interested in this, which you must be to show up on a talk on a Monday night, spend a week or two reading the labels. Genuinely spend a week or two and really start to have a look and start to really, particularly if you know you have something, if it comes out of a packet, if it comes out the freezer, if it comes out of a tin, start to have a look. And if you don't know something, if there's a code, it's really easy. Go online and type in that code and it'll tell you what that core ingredient is in layman's terms. And start to say, well, where are these things starting to feature? One of the ones I come across a lot is salt. People go, I don't add salt to anything. But then you look at how many processed foods are in their diet and you go, these are all enhanced with salt. They're all in there. People who think because they've cut out chocolate bars that they're now on a low sugar diet, and you go, let's just wait a minute. Let's have a look at these drinks over here. Let's have a look at these ready-made foods. Let's have a look at how much sugar, salt, fats appear in these foods. And that's a real way to equate it, because a lot of people get frustrated because they'll say, well, I've cut out red meat, I don't really have much white meat. Where are these saturated fats coming into the diet? So I would encourage you to kind of do a bit of a stock check on the other types of foods that you might be eating. And then also, because of what happens, and this is a direct insight to the data, what happens when we increase the EPA and the DHA, then we start to counterbalance the impact and the effect of the saturated fats anyway. And that's really interesting. That's something that Emily and I are starting to look more closely at. Emily's our real in-house specialist on the omegas. And we're starting to look at that relationship all the more closely. And we're starting to access the wider literature and look at our own database. But we're seeing this consistently. When we increase the EPA and the DHA, by virtue of that, the saturated fat's lower. And that's where it's becoming interesting for me with regards to that type 2 diabetes project I was telling you about.
Thanks, Dr. Coll, as usual, for an amazing presentation and all the content. Extremely informative, and you know, it's great to know obviously what the blood test reveals, and more importantly, you know, how would a very bespoke blood test, and the importance of the blood test, really, that we, you know, we expand this and we test as many of our friends and family as possible, really. So yes, thank you so much, and thanks everyone for attending this evening. I hope you all enjoyed it. Pretty sure you did. And look forward to on Wednesday, where we've got a Zoom with Dr. Paul Clayton, who's going to be talking about world-leading skin brands versus Zinzino products. Okay, look forward to seeing you all soon. Good night.